Welcome back to Season 4 of the How We Can Heal podcast. My name is Lisa Danylchuk, and I'm a psychotherapist specializing in trauma treatment. I created this podcast because I'm surrounded by people who have dedicated their lives to navigating healing. There is so much wisdom in each guest this season, and my hope is that this show makes their important ideas and experiences available to you in a way that uplifts and inspires you. These guests and I have committed our lives to fostering health and joy in the world, even as we work through the impacts of trauma and face deep challenges. Let's dive into Season 4 and let's keep talking about how we can heal. I want to give a big shout out and extend a huge thank you to the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, the ISSTD, for sponsoring this episode. If you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, you've heard me talk about the ISSTD and the incredible researchers, clinicians, and advocates I've met during my time as a member and a volunteer there. This group is made up of some of the kindest, most inspiring, intelligent people, and I'm happy to be able to share just a few of them here on the show. This organization has been delving into the science and best practice of treating trauma and dissociation for over 40 years now, and they have a rich catalog of educational offerings for both professionals and non-professionals on their website. That's cfas.isst-d.org. If you're a mental health professional, I highly recommend you consider becoming a member of ISSTD. I'd love to see you during their live educational offerings and at the annual conference in Boston in March of 2025. Go to isst-d.org to learn more. Welcome back to the How We Can Heal podcast. Today, our guest is Dr. Lauren Lebois. Dr. Lauren Lebois is a cognitive neuroscientist who is passionate about understanding how the mind, brain, and body adapt in the aftermath of trauma. Her National Institute of Mental Health funded research program focuses on the neurobiology of dissociation in trauma spectrum disorders. She prioritizes translating scientific breakthroughs in accessible, compelling, and clinically relevant ways. Dr. Lebois serves as the chair of the scientific committee of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation, or ISSTD. She's also the operations co-director of the Initiative for Integrated Trauma Research, Care, and Training at McLean Hospital in Belmont, Massachusetts. Recently, she was awarded the Alfred Pope Award for Young Investigators from McLean and the Pierre Genet Writing Award and the Morton Prince Award from the ISSTD. Dr. Lebois is deeply committed to using her advances in neurobiology, behavior, and treatments to reduce stigma and improve care for individuals living with PTSD and dissociative identity disorder. Lauren and I connected some years ago through the ISSTD. I have always appreciated her thoughtful and thorough presentations, and I'm thrilled to share her with you today. Let's welcome Lauren to the show. Well, welcome, Lauren Lebois. It's so good to have you here. I've been to a bunch of your presentations and I'm always like, everyone needs to hear this. Everyone needs to know this. So I'm excited to share, a little bit of your background, your experience, and hopefully connect people to your work a little bit more.
Thank you. That's very kind, Lisa.
So I have to ask first, how's everything going with the babes? Because you and I had kids right around the same time. So it's kind of a miracle that we're both here. It's been quite a journey.
Yes, I feel like you captured it right there. Yeah, but things are going really well. It does feel like a lot and it's pretty intense, but it's more just like the extremes, like just a moment of joy.
Yes.
And instantly 3 seconds later, the pits of despair.
The chaos.
Yeah. But
you had twins too, and then you already have one? You had one before that too? Okay.
Yes.
I just have the one. I'm already like, oh my goodness gracious, it's a lot. Like, this is how humanity continues. Wow. Okay. There's a lot that goes into it. All right. I thought I was aware. I'm not that aware. Now I'm learning. So I'm curious, just to start, I always love to just go to a little bit of like your background. How did you come to learn about trauma and dissociation? How did this become such a big part of your world?
Yeah, I Yeah, I guess I feel like I've learned the most from our research participants. They've been the best teachers for me. Hearing them talk about their experiences, what it's like inside their mind, has been so fascinating. And then I think at the same time, I had the great fortune of getting connected with Dr. Melissa Kaufman, who I now jointly direct the Dissociative Disorders and Trauma Research Program with, but learning from her throughout my training. And just, she's one of those people who, well, she's an amazing psychiatrist and clinician. And she's just one of those people who asks really beautiful questions of people that they just reveal the most amazing things, with the way, just her presence and how she asks questions. And so I think both from watching her and how she asks questions and hearing how people reply about these things, has been, where I've learned the most. And I think, I'm someone who's always been fascinated ever since I was little by people's stories. And that
Yes.
moment where like you're in conversation with someone and you can see or like feel that they feel seen is just so thrilling to me. I love those little micro moments. And so this is a place, well, I feel like I kind of fell into it by a chance of opportunities. It was like, oh, this is home. This is where I can hear the most amazing stories and help in some way by kind of putting a quantitative data point to it.
And I
So
think your work does that. It helps people feel seen because it describes something that it can be difficult to encapsulate or to validate, right? And when you come at it from that quantitative or very tangible standpoint, it's like, okay, there, yeah, that's me, or oh, that's how that works. And naming it and just letting that land instead of being up in the land of what's happening here. How is this
yeah,
working? Yeah.
exactly. That's the hope. That's what we're
Yeah.
hoping.
So, what does your day to day work look like? Are you just like, I just imagine you around fMRI machines all the time. Is that what it's like?
Yeah, I feel like at this point, my position is much more administrative. So it's a lot of writing, analyzing data, writing grants, writing papers, managing the lab, mentoring trainees. I get less face to face time with research participants and like sitting at the imaging center, but
Yeah.
I get over there once in a while. Yeah.
I don't know if I told you this, but I actually, when I first got to Harvard, I volunteered for a study at McLean. It was about yoga and GABA levels.
Amazing.
So I think maybe that's why I just really put you like right in those. I was in an fMRI machine. I went in before. I did an hour of yoga while they watched me, and then I went back in after. And I just really put you in right there. And maybe that's near where you've worked, and maybe it's not. But yeah,
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
there's one imaging center, so yeah, it's right there.
that's probably where you and Melissa hang out quite a bit, even though you're doing a lot of other stuff now too. So I want to try to translate, and I know we're not going to like go through a PowerPoint here, but I've seen you present also. I think it was the Grand Rounds at Harvard. You had a presentation at some point that you sort of opened up access to. I want to like help people listen in on that. So rather than going into like explaining all of like what trauma is and what dissociation is. We've talked a lot about that in other podcasts. So I'm just wondering if you can start to speak to some of the things you've seen as you've taken in this fMRI data, as you've worked with people around like changes in the brain with post-traumatic stress, with PTSD. And I think we can kind of tease that out. So is there anywhere you'd want to start in like the overview of what you've learned about post-traumatic stress from looking more closely at the brain?
That's a great question. I think it does, the context of it depends so much, or matters so much rather. So what we ask someone to do in the scanner will really dictate what looks different in their brain if they have PTSD versus not, or have a more complex post-traumatic adaptation like DID. So I think a good place that to start would be what it looks like, what's different when someone is feeling really activated and symptomatic or triggered.
Yes.
Um, and maybe just briefly, we could touch on different types of post-traumatic adaptation. So we've got PTSD,
Yes.
dissociative subtype of PTSD, and dissociative identity disorder.
And I'm just going to repeat those: PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, dissociative subtype of PTSD, and DID, or dissociative identity disorder.
Yeah. And there's a woman, Sachi Nakajima, who has this, I love her metaphor of a roller coaster for how to describe the differences between those three different conditions. Talks about, like, imagine you're on a roller coaster. So I guess first I should say Sachi is a nonprofit founder, and she is a lecturer and an author, and she's also open about being a survivor of domestic violence herself.
Okay.
But she talks about, for PTSD, imagine you're on a roller coaster and you're feeling that really intense adrenaline rush, and it's a frightening experience for you to be on this roller coaster. Versus the dissociative subtype of PTSD, where imagine if somehow in your mind you can make it feel like you were standing on the ground watching yourself be on the roller coaster. Provides that level of detachment. So these are folks who report feelings of depersonalization and derealization, where they feel a sense of detachment from their body or their sense of self or their surroundings, where it feels like they're watching themselves from above, or they're in a movie or in a dream, something like that.
Yeah.
And then add another layer on with conditions like DID, where not only can you make it feel like you're standing on the ground watching yourself on the roller coaster, but it feels like someone else is on the roller coaster and you're watching from afar. So that's where you get this added layer of dissociation, where people lose a sense of agency and ownership over some feelings or memories or actions, or the sense of their body, to the point where sometimes it can feel like it's someone else living in their mind.
I thought you were going to go to, like, passed out on the roller coaster, right? Like, because that's like a meme probably somewhere. You can look at someone who just got so afraid on the roller coaster that they just passed out. And then they come to the end, they're like, are we starting yet? And you're like, oh, it already happened.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that, Lisa. I think maybe that could be like certain experiences in DID where it feels like you weren't there for, or you're like have that full amnesia of a fully dissociated experience, I guess.
It happened. Maybe someone else was there and has a full narrative of it, but you're just like, what? Where was I?
Yeah. But I think, as you know, the more common experiences that you have some, like, you're kind of an observer while someone else takes the wheel and drives on.
Yeah.
So I think setting the stage with those different types of post-traumatic adaptation, and then as far as what's going on in the brain when someone's feeling symptomatic, the way researchers typically study this, they're called symptom provocation paradigms.
Yeah.
They have folks come in and narrate a traumatic experience they've had. They play this recording back to them while they're in a scanner. The idea being that while someone's feeling triggered or symptomatic, then they can capture what's happening in the brain at those moments while they're getting immersed in this traumatic experience that they had.
So this is the functional changes, like as it's happening, this is the different activity in the moment.
Exactly.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
And so typically what happens in this paradigm for someone without PTSD is that, well, actually, I should first talk about two key brain regions that often come up in this paradigm and have been studied a lot in the trauma literature: the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And there's a particular region of the prefrontal cortex, kind of right in the middle in the front, called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's involved in lots of different functions, but kind of as a shorthand, we can think of it as an executive controller, helping to regulate our emotional and physical reactions to things. So that's a key region. And then also the amygdala, which again, involved in lots of different things. As a shorthand, we kind of think of it as a salience detector, helping to alert us really quickly to things that would be important to pay attention to for our survival. And one example of something that's important to pay attention to are potential threats. And so for someone in this symptom provocation paradigm who doesn't have PTSD, typically what you'd see is a rapid activation of amygdala to help mount a full body stress response to deal with this threatening information. And then once that threat has passed, you see activation of ventromedial prefrontal cortex, kind of helping to dampen things down, regulate things, because that the threat isn't actually there. You're just listening to a narrative about what's happened to you. Um, that's how it typically works in PTSD and classic PTSD. So that where you're on the roller coaster, like feeling that big hyperarousal response, um, we see activation in the amygdala, but less activation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So it's as if the brakes are off in a way, and your body's kind of constantly mounting the stress response to deal with threats, even when they're not there anymore. So that's classic PTSD. The dissociative subtype, where you've got that more detachment from the experience with the use of dissociation, we see the opposite pattern. So more activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, less activity in regions like the amygdala. So it's kind of like the brakes are on too tightly. You're almost like
Yeah.
too good at dampening things down. And that matches what people say about their experience, that they feel numb and detached in those triggered moments. And then for folks with DID, Simone Reinders has done a lot of this work in this paradigm where she and her team have folks listen to the trauma narrative in two different self states. So one that feels more hyper aroused, emotionally flooded, and has some ownership over the trauma memory, feels that it happened to them personally. And then also has them listen to the trauma narrative when they're in a different state where they feel more distance, more numb and detached, and less ownership over the memory, to the point where maybe it feels like it happened to somebody else. And what she sees as in these different states is that it matches or it mirrors to a certain extent the patterns in the different types of PTSD. So when someone's in that more the ownership over the trauma memory, feeling more hyper aroused, you get the activation in the amygdala, less activity in regions like the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and then the opposite when they're feeling more numb and detached in that distance from the trauma memory. So it's as if they're kind of switching between these two different PTSD patterns when depending on what self state they're in the paradigm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think it's so helpful to parse all those out, because we can get really kind of binary in it and be like, oh, just more ventromedial prefrontal cortex is the answer, right? We just got to get that on board and get that on board and get that on board. And that's the narrative I see a lot in like trauma informed trainings that are very light, right? Like an intro, right? It's very focused on hyperarousal. And it's not so aware or inclusive of dissociation and understanding, like sometimes it's the opposite and sometimes it's one person and it's both, right? And it's alternating and dancing around, and working with that becomes really important. I would generally say the more severe the trauma is, the more important it is that you're working with those dissociative parts. So we want to be in service of folks who have experienced these really severe and ongoing and complex and developmental trauma, and have developed ways to adapt and deal with it, like standing on the ground watching the roller coaster, or being a different person on the roller coaster, and like really serving those people, as well as folks who are in the abject terror. It makes me think a little bit of like, I worked in classrooms a lot early in my career, and like the quiet kid in the classroom, right? Like the one who's throwing, ink pens at the teacher. Okay, they get attention, but like the one who's never saying anything, but kind of feel like something's going on. A lot of times, like, oh, they're fine. There's just nothing to see here. It's like, well, doesn't mean there's nothing happening.
Exactly. Yeah. It's all gone internal.
So those are the functional changes you see in the fMRI. What do you see in terms of structural change when someone's been living with PTSD a long time, or when someone's been living with DID for a long time?
Yeah, that's another great question. I find it harder to parse the structural findings. I think we're not quite at a point in the field where we know if the differences kind of pre-existed the condition or if they're a result of having these symptoms. And like you said, becoming this habitual response over time. Though I suppose to a certain extent, we are less certain about that in the functional data as well. But one finding that comes up time and time again, and they've now done really huge consortia-based studies with hundreds of people with PTSD. A common finding that has been replicated is that the hippocampus is smaller or differently shaped for people with PTSD. And that's a region of the brain involved in memory function. And it's also really sensitive to stress-related hormones and chemicals in our body. And so that kind of has a lot of face validity. If you're constantly activating your stress system, that has structural changes in the impact of structural changes in your brain, especially in areas that are really sensitive to it, like the hippocampus. Yeah, and again, Simone Reinders has done some structural work in DID, and it's the differences across the brain are really distributed. So I don't know that we have like this clear, like, this is what it means, here are the patterns. One finding that I feel really intrigued by are that the basal ganglia in folks with DID often are larger in some of Simone's work, and no one's really followed up on that yet. So I feel really curious about what that means. That region of the brain, again, involved with lots of different things, but helping to kind of task switch and just do motor related activation, some reward related activity. So that again kind of makes sense if you're having to, like, you've got lots of different streams of competing, conflicting thoughts happening, and you're having to like manage that, but maybe the basal ganglia is involved there. But it does come up time and time again. So I feel I'd like someone out there to follow up on that and help us understand what's happening.
I know, and I had Simone Reinders on the podcast, and super informative. So appreciate her research, but I don't think we talked about the basal ganglia. So maybe I'll have her back and we'll just talk about that.
Yeah,
more about it. But so many of these things are interconnected, right? Because you're talking about hyperarousal, you're talking about managing fear, managing salience, what's threatening, what's not. You're talking about executive function in terms of managing like that response, but also memory when you talk about the hippocampus. And that makes me think of, knowing and not knowing, and what is it helpful to know? What is it? And the salience piece with that, like, what's most important to know? Is it most important to know where you left your keys, or is it more important to not know this? And I don't know enough. I'm not a neuroscientist, but like, I do understand, as far as I understand, our brain is always trying to decide, like, what do we need to keep and what's just recycle it, move on. And so finding, like, sifting through all of that, and like you were saying with the basal ganglia, of like prioritizing or choosing, that's what I heard from what you were saying, is like there's this task switching and integrative almost function there, I would wonder.
Exactly. Yeah, and how it speaks to other networks in the brain, I think, will be key too, especially in DID, either to allow them to do really amazing things in their mind and with their attention, and then of course can also get in the way in some day-to-day life situations.
If you're listening to this podcast thinking, I want to learn more body-based tools to help support trauma recovery, then you might be the perfect candidate for the Yoga for Trauma online training program. This 8-week certification is for wellness providers and enthusiasts who want to learn the theory and best practices for providing yoga and somatic tools to those navigating the impacts of trauma. Students often come into the Yoga for Trauma online training program, or Y4T as it's come to be known, knowing at a deep level that mindful movement can help with trauma recovery, but not knowing precisely how to articulate it or share these tools with others. Y4T breaks it all down and leaves you feeling clear about your choices as you support folks navigating post-traumatic stress. Of course, the experience is good for you too. With 8 modules and 8 yoga classes, you'll get a taste of how it feels to practice yoga in a trauma-responsive manner. Head on over to howwecanheal.com/Y4T to apply and join the program today. Mention the podcast in your application for a special bonus. One more time, nice and slow. The website is howwecanheal.com/the letter Y, the number 4, and the letter T. Looking forward to seeing you there. This just came to mind. I don't think I've asked you this before. What are your thoughts on, I know you're at McLean Hospital, but it's, which McLean is it? There's like Paul McLean, and then there's another one who had the triune brain model. What are your thoughts on like some of the simplistic stuff that gets out of like, we have 3 parts of our brain and this is the model, and that they're built upon each other? Because I've heard some controversy around that. And as we're talking about these different regions, I'm aware of just how complex anything is and how hard it is to even isolate different areas and say, this is what this does and this is what that does. It's like, yeah, we see the activation, we see the different patterns. I'm sure you see that all the time, but there's also a lot of unknown with our brains. And then there's this desire to know, and we want to get in our hands. So we have our hand brain model. And I'm wondering what you, from your role, how you think and feel about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a careful line to walk between making something really, like you said, like tangible, translatable, easy to explain, and still holding how complex it really is, and that regions in the brain are involved in lots of different functions, and we're still understanding that, and it's not being too reductive about like, this region does this thing and we got to fix it in blah 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 condition. So yeah, I think it's really complex, and that makes it really challenging to be like, okay, what can I really say about these findings that doesn't sound really abstract and hand wavy, and is more exciting than just like, there's a difference in this one task.
Right. Yeah.
Because there's something more we could say from it. So I think our team tries to be really careful about trying to translate it so it's accessible beyond expert neuroscientists, but still, not being so reductive that it's misleading.
Right. Yeah. Even something as simple like, I know when I first learned or was exposed to the hand brain model, it was all about getting the executive function on board. And I've seen people teach it that way a million times, right? It's like, oh, you get traumatized. And for those of you watching on video, I'm doing it with my hand. You open your hand, and then the base of your palm is your brainstem, and that's your emergency response. And then your limbic response is your thumb, and that folds in. And then your prefrontal comes on board. It's like very 1, 2, 3 step. And it was always focused on getting getting the prefrontal cortex on board. But I just love even the point of looking at the fMRI and going, actually, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex is more active when the dissociation is happening. So that doesn't necessarily mean, oh, we're good, we're healed, we got it online. That's not the only story or the end of the story.
Yeah, it's like we need a Goldilocks model or something.
Yes, I love that.
We're like Goldilocks. Yeah.
Not too hyper aroused, not too hypo aroused, like just right. That would be really funny to write a Goldilocks book on trauma and dissociation.
Yeah. Yeah, or even just like something like helping someone gain control of it so they can turn it off when they don't need it. I guess that would be a nice first step too.
Yeah, I always think of it like bridges. Like, can you bridge from the too cold porridge to the just right porridge? Can you bridge from the too hot? You have those tools. You have some ice and a microwave around, or a pot and pan.
Exactly. Yeah.
So given everything you've been exposed to, the people you've worked with, the ways that you've seen people like have their stories witnessed and be seen, what do you feel like it's important for everyone to understand about post-traumatic stress, trauma, dissociation?
I think, well, we've kind of touched on one of them. One of the things I think is really important a little bit already is just the paradoxical nature of them, in that they're both your mind, your brain, your body adapt to the environment that you're in really beautifully to help you survive it and make it through to the other side. So they are these brilliant adaptations. And then also, once you're out of those environments, they can get in the way of being able to live the full life that you want to live. Or so I think holding that paradox is really important. And then I also, just focusing in more on the brain side of things, I feel like while your brain, for example, is adapted to this particular traumatic environment, it can adapt again to a different one. And I think that's like the wonderful thing about therapy and treatment and interventions, is that you're laying down new connections, new patterns in your brain. That's possible too.
Yeah. Yeah. The neuroplasticity and the opportunity for healing and change.
Yeah.
Which I know from hearing from folks a lot of times, like that feels like another world, that feels impossible, that feels really challenging, or on the road to healing as we're kind of going through that up and down and left and right path. It's like, when am I ever going to get there? I also noticed, though, I don't know if you see this in your research in any way, that people just don't often notice their progress. Like we just kind of go from where we are to, I don't know if it's that, if there's like the evolutionary sort of problem focus that we have, but it just seems like having the opportunity to look at something you wrote a year ago, or having your goals from therapy read back to you. And you're like, oh, I mean, I've had that as a client, like, oh, that's not an issue anymore. It's been 12 weeks and that's not even a thing. But I'm still here and I still think things are rough. Right.
Yes.
It's so interesting how we work that way.
Yeah, that is fascinating. It makes me also think of, I haven't looked into her work in a long time, but there's a researcher at Chicago. Her name's Susan Golden Meadow, and she looks a lot at gesture, and she'll show that, like, when you're learning something new or you're just about to get there with some new concept, you'll show it sometimes in your gestures in your body, like the correct answer. The example that's coming to mind is, I think she did some work with children learning a new math concept like multiplication or division or something, and that their hand would actually point to the right answer as they were saying the wrong one, but that was a signal that they were like just about there to be able to say the right answer, and sooner than someone who was still like gesturing to the incorrect answer. But it just made me think of her work, and I don't know if anyone's looked at that in the trauma world, but that would be really fascinating as well to look at.
Yeah, definitely.
There.
Yeah, I mean, that just makes me think too of just child development and watching kids learn things, right? Because they'll repeat, and then finally, like something clicks. I'm going to look out for that in Isabella now. Like, is your hand going that way, or what's happening?
Yeah.
So interesting. So what's something you've learned recently that's new or that changes the way you're thinking about trauma and recovery?
I've had the great opportunity to be in conversation recently with Dr. Patricia June Vickers, who's a First Nations individual. She's the principal consultant at Raven's Call, which is this organization that conducts trainings for mental health professionals about Indigenous perspectives on healing trauma and PTSD. And she was telling me and some colleagues about an Indigenous concept of soul loss in the realm of trauma and dissociation. And the example she used was, like, imagine someone who's experienced child sexual abuse, part of their soul breaks away and stays in the abuser's room. And the role of the healer is to kind of take them back to that room and retrieve when their soul is lost, and retrieve the part of the soul and bring it back into the body and the memory. And so the memory gaps that you see in trauma are evidence of this soul loss. And I just found this concept so moving and resonant with the narratives that research participants who've come through the studies, how they talk about these experiences. And I love the richness of that concept.
Yeah, and it makes me think too of like Peruvian shamanism. I think there's a very similar practice there, I'm sure in a lot of other places in the world. But that's so powerful, right? And I think of it through that the story lens, right? Or that healer's journey with the person who's going back to retrieve their soul. And then I also think about it from like, what are we doing now as therapists that kind of feels like that? Like, oh, hypnosis and EMDR, where you're in the room with the 7-year-old. What does the 7-year-old need? Right. So it's interesting to find those points of parallel or connection.
Definitely.
No. And is there anything that you're finding really interesting in the work right now? Like, what's a compelling question, maybe a research study that you're digging into now?
We've got a couple things going that I'm really excited about. So one of the things we've already published on is focused on trauma related dissociation, and particularly severe levels of it in DID. And we see, so we had people, everyone had PTSD, everyone had varied levels of dissociation, including some folks with DID. And we had them go in the scanner and do a resting state scan. So in these scans, you don't give them particular tasks. They're kind of allowed to think about whatever they want. And we can capture activity in different networks in the brain when people are doing this. And what we found is that we were able to look at what was happening in the brain and how we call this functional connectivity. So the extent to which different regions or networks in the brain are active at the same time. They're presumably involved in a similar function. And the jargon we use for this is functional connectivity. So we're able to look at that and use it to predict what folks had put down on a self-report of their levels of dissociation to a certain extent. We weren't able to predict the whole kit and caboodle, but we were able to carve out a piece of it and predict that. And so I feel excited about that finding because it's this proof of concept first attempt at, can we take an, quote unquote objective marker of dissociation in someone's body, brain, and predict what they would say on a self-report. And down the line, probably much down the line, how can we use this to help corroborate people's reports, or if there's some situation in a medical legal context where someone would need this corroborating evidence to kind of support what they're saying in their story. That seems particularly exciting to me. Yeah, so that's really exciting. And then something that's hot off the presses, in collaboration with Dr. Ann Shin, who's this expert in psychotic disorders and psychosis, in our same sample. So a lot of folks with PTSD, dissociative subtypes, some with DID. She was honing in on voice hearing and that experience that folks with PTSD and DID can have, and what's going on in the brain. Can we use what's going on in the brain to predict people's level of voice hearing that they're reporting? And in particular, how does that square up to voice hearing in, for example, schizophrenia?
Yeah.
So she found that a lot of the same regions in the brain that are implicated in voice hearing and schizophrenia are active, but they're communicating differently with each other in PTSD and DID compared to schizophrenia, and actually showing an opposite pattern where in PTSD and DID, there's this over recruitment of default mode network, which is a network in the brain related to self-related thinking. Sorry, this is in schizophrenia. So they're over recruiting that network into auditory regions of the brain. The communication there it's kind of hyper connected, which matches kind of that blurring of self-other boundaries in schizophrenia.
Yeah.
Versus in PTSD and DID, we saw the opposite, where there was under recruitment of this default mode network with the auditory regions. And that kind of matches what people are talking about, a sense of not me, that this is, it's missing that self tag, whatever that is, how that works in the brain. So I think it's this potential unique mechanism to distinguish voice hearing in PTSD and DID from voice hearing in schizophrenia, though we haven't done the direct comparison with people with schizophrenia in the same study under the same conditions yet. That's kind of the next frontier. But I feel really excited about that because I'm sure, as you know, Lisa, so often people, if you're reporting some sort of voice hearing, you kind of automatically get bucketed in a psychosis category. And then, of course, the treatments are very different and it just prolongs someone's journey before they can get connected to the treatments that would actually help them. So
I'm always sad when I hear, and this sometimes is even personally, like I get a lot of people, like I went to elementary school who reach out and they're like, help, my child or my person needs a therapist and here's 3 points. And sometimes I hear stories or clinical referrals too of people who are reporting that they're hearing voices and just getting the tidbit that like, oh, there is a trauma history and this is happening and they're diagnosed with schizophrenia. I'm always like, like, has anyone integrated that background piece? Are they looking at that? Are they understanding that? Are they understanding the role? So it sounds like this research would really help parse that out too, and just be another point of data to bring in to any kind of diagnosis and treatment planning of like, oh, it seems like it's working more this way. And it makes me think of Heather Hall we had on early in the podcast to talk about dissociation and schizophrenia. And a lot of what she saw working at General Hospital in San Francisco was people who had severe trauma histories who appeared schizophrenic, right? Their behavior, they were hearing voices, they were responding to those voices. But once she started getting a narrative, it was like, this actually makes a lot of sense, right? This isn't psychosis. This is you responding to someone from the past in the present. And that's very different. So I'm excited to hear about that research and to see where it goes.
yeah, me too.
And hopefully get some of those more side-by-side studies, right? Where you can just tighten it up even more research-wise.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. So you know a lot about the brain, you know a lot about trauma and dissociation and stress responses. I'm curious, as a mom, like how does this impact how you work with yourself as a parent when it gets stressful? How does it impact how you relate to your children or even, your partner or people in your space? What do you notice that might be unique to you or to someone in your role?
That's a fascinating question. The first thing that comes to mind, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Becky Kennedy, and
Yeah.
I love something that she talks about with repair is really resonant with my background in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. But basically, this idea that when our memories are not set audiovisual recordings that are static. If you think about a memory or think about a past experience, you're to a certain extent reactivating that memory trace and it's open again. It's a little bit malleable. And so I feel like I think about this a lot as a parent when I have those moments of like, I did not show up in the way that I wanted, or my emotion regulation was not what I wanted in that scenario. But it's just like so calming to kind of know that I can come back to it, in the afternoon, reactivate that memory for them, open up that trace again, and do a repair. Talk about how it wasn't their fault and they're a good kid, and mom's just was having trouble with her big emotions, and I'm working on that. And so a metaphor I was thinking about related to this is it's almost like I'm a musician, so I like thinking about it in this way, but the memory is like the original song that got laid down, and you can go back and add a harmony that brightens it up a little bit and then helps them feel not as alone.
I really like that. Like it's a song I was thinking you can remix it too, right?
Yeah.
You can like pull a sample and make it something even different now.
Yeah. Exactly.
I didn't even know you were a musician. What do you play or do you sing?
Yeah, I sing a little bit. love singing harmonies, and I play the fiddle.
Awesome. Oh, that's fun. That sounds fun. Do you get to play much these days? I feel like your life is so full.
Yeah, much less than I did before kids, but more recently I've kind of clawed my way back to it a little bit to carve out some time because I find it, um, I love being in that headspace and I miss it a lot. So
Are you in a band?
I am, yeah, yeah.
Do you want to
Not
share the
playing,
name?
yeah, it's called Folkstone, and the main singer songwriter, um, we do some originals and lots of covers as well, but kind of in an acoustic folky vibe.
I love that so much because when I was out in Massachusetts, I kind of got into that type of music, right? Like I
Mhm.
remember going to see, I'm going to forget. Do you know, is it Donna and the Buffalo? Do you know them?
Yeah.
So folksy. And I'd just like go out to upstate New York and just like some barn and go watch them play. And like, that was very much a part of my Massachusetts experience. So I love that like you're back there. I'm just having all these harmonies in my brain overlapping of like, oh, driving out in upstate New York and listening to fiddle and all the other lovely instruments that go into that type of music. That's so fun. Maybe one day I'll get to see you perform. That'd be fun.
That's good. Are you a musician yourself, Lisa?
I'm not. No, my older brother was, but I like took drum lessons once and they just had the little pad and I was just impatient. I wanted the full drum kit. I probably went for maybe a couple months and then I just lost interest. And my brothers tried to teach me to play guitar, but my hands were too small at the time
Mhm.
and it just never circled back around. And then I remember I've always loved singing. I still love singing. But I remember going to a voice lesson in high school. It was just at like the local rec center, but it was one-on-one. And the instructor just played like probably middle C, like, okay, sing that. And I was like, I gotta go. Too self-conscious as a teenager or something. I don't know, because I wanted to do it. But maybe I just had too much ventral medial prefrontal cortex going on. I was like,
Brakes. The brakes are too tight.
I gotta go. And she was like, what? It's okay. But funny story, I did find a friend on Craigslist of all places that ended up being really legit. And we traded yoga for voice lessons for a little while.
Wow,
And that
amazing.
was really fun because it was just super. I was older at the time, so I could I could actually do the practice and let myself sound a little off key and all that. But yeah, so she helped me refine my Little Mermaid. So maybe one, I don't know. It's not performance level. It's just like the shower level. Because I used to love the Little Mermaid when I was younger.
Amazing.
It's my music story.
I love it. Well, it's
Yeah.
always there. It's always there for you to return to.
Right. I can build some harmonies in there. So I feel like your work is so rich, has so much depth. If someone's just learning about your work, you and Melissa Kaufman and all the research teams that you've worked with, where would you send them to get to just next step, get a little bit more and start exposing themselves more to what you've done?
Yeah, I guess we have a lab website, so it's www.ddtrp.com, and that's just an acronym for our lab, Dissociative Disorders and Trauma Research Program.
Okay.
Um, we have a manuscript that's more translated for a non-neuroscientist audience called I Am Not I, the Neuroscience of Dissociative Identity Disorder. And all of our publications were federally funded. So that means the research must be available to the taxpayers and people can access it for free. And we post them on our website there. But
That's
that
great.
one is kind of a good landing place to get a little bit of the history, a little bit of some of the key findings in DID without all of the neuroscience jargon. We also, Melissa Kaufman, Bethany Brand, Rich Lowenstein, Matt Robinson, and myself are putting on an inaugural co-hosted McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School virtual course on dissociative identity disorder. And it's happening this September 18th through 21st. And so that will really take you, I think, to the next level, a deeper dive into DID. And I feel really excited about this course because, as you know, Lisa, DID is so understudied and misunderstood often, and it's not a part of people's training programs in health or mental health professions, but its prevalence is so high. It's more prevalent than schizophrenia. So I feel like there's this great need to fill the gap in understanding. And it's really designed for a broad swath of people. So nurses, nurse practitioners, counselors, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, other physicians. We really tried to make it translatable and accessible. And we're going to cover how to assess DID, how to understand why it comes to be, how to treat it. We've got faculty from all over the world, and they include people with lived experience as well. So I encourage folks to explore the possibility of that course.
Is that going to be online, or is that in person out there?
It's virtual, yeah. So that was our hope too, that making it virtual, we could reach a lot more folks from all over.
And where can people find out more about that?
Yeah, we have a course website up. The link is kind of long, so maybe we could put it in the show notes or something. But
yeah, definitely. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I'd love to get that link. And I'm like, I'm like, if only this would have been there 20 years ago. I mean, it's definitely an idea and a course whose time has come. So I'm so glad it's happening.
Thank you.
That's great. So you've got a full life, you've got a family, you've got a lot of research going on. You do research on some of the, I would say, most or more challenging diagnosis, and, probably hear stories about pretty rough things that people have been through in their lives. So I'm wondering what keeps a sense of hope alive for you in your life, in your work.
Yeah, my first gut reaction to that question, I'm just going to go with it. I think I love self-deprecating humor, and I think our team is we have a lot of people who love that as well. So I think those moments where we get to laugh with each other about silly things that we've done to make sense of ourselves is really a highlight that gives me so much joy. So I think that's my gut response to that.
That's also so funny, because I feel like when I was in Massachusetts, I was around a lot of people and there was a lot of self-deprecating humor going on. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's fun to just like hold it lightly, right? Like take yourself less seriously, poke a little fun.
Definitely. That's what gives me hope.
Nice. So how can people connect with you? Is the lab website the best place?
I think so, yes. Definitely. That's a good landing page for people to start.
And other than the amazing training that's coming up, you said it's September 18th to 21st, right?
Yes.
Is there anything else, any big presentations or other things you want to share?
I don't think so. I think those are the two big ones.
Okay, great. I love it. Well, thanks so much for being here. Thank you for your work. Thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you for just being an awesome human in the world, for the folk music you play, for the jokes you make.
Thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful to be in conversation, and I would say the same to you. Thank you for having this platform and all the work that you do, both in like the society level and with individual folks in your practice. So
thank you, Lauren. Thanks so much for listening. My hope is that you walk away from these episodes feeling supported and like you have a place to come to find the hope and inspiration you need to take your next small step forward. For more information and resources, please visit howwecanheal.com. There, you'll find tons of helpful resources and the show notes for each show. Thanks for your messages, feedback, and ideas about the podcast. I love hearing from you, and I so appreciate your support. There are lots of ways you can support the show, and I'm grateful for every little bit of love you share. If you love the show, please leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Audible, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can always visit howwecanheal.com/podcast to share your thoughts and ideas as well. Before we wrap, I want to be clear that this podcast isn't offering any prescriptions, It's not advice or any kind of diagnosis. Your decisions are in your hands, and we encourage you to consult with any healthcare professionals you may need to support you through your unique path of healing. In addition, everyone's opinion on this show is their own, and opinions can change, right? Guests share their thoughts, not that of the host or sponsors. I'd also like to send just huge thanks to our guest today, to Kyle Arizbal of Prolific Sound Solutions, and to everyone who helps support this podcast directly and indirectly. Alex, thanks for taking care of the babe and the fur babies while I record. Lastly, I'd like to give a shout out to my big brother, Matt, who passed away in 2002. He wrote this music, and it makes my heart so happy to share it with you here.